What's this, a sequel? Oh yeah, I've got even more disturbing books to recommend. By far, my most popular video on this channel, at least so far, has been one of my relatively early videos in which I listed 5 of the most disturbing books I've ever read. But when I posted it, I made it clear I wasn't listing the 5 most disturbing books, but 5 of the most disturbing books. So now I'm back with another installment. I've selected 5 more of the most disturbing horror books, and I imagine I've chosen a few that will be new to at least most of you. So, as was the case last time, I'm not saying these are the absolute most disturbing books, but I found them all quite disturbing in a variety of different ways. I'm also not saying they're necessarily my favorite books, although I do highly recommend all of them. Nor am I saying they're necessarily the scariest books. Scary and disturbing are related, but not quite the same thing. These books might not make you hide under the covers or sleep with the lights on, but they'll kill your faith in humanity, turn your stomach, or otherwise just mess with your head. Also, like last time, I'm not arranging these in order from most to least or from least to most disturbing. However, unlike last time, I did actually pay more attention to the order in which I put these books, because rather than just picking a random 5 of the most disturbing books, I've chosen a specific 5, each of which represents something distinct or a different kind of disturbingness. Of course, I'll point you toward the books with links down in the What's It so you can check them out for yourself. If you want to stay up to date with more book recommendations and anything and everything to do with horror, do be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. While you're at it, click the like button and leave me a comment with some of your own favorite disturbing books. And now, without further ado, let's get to the books themselves. The first one, I freely admit, is not nearly as disturbing as the others, and that book is Uzumaki by Junji Ito. However, though it's not as messed up as the others, I've chosen to include it for 2 important reasons. First, because it has some disturbing elements without being quite as crazy as my other choices, it's a good gateway to disturbing literature for people who aren't quite as desensitized to everything as I am. Second, because this is a graphic novel, it makes a great example of some actually quite disturbing visuals. Uzumaki is the story of a small town on the coast of Japan that becomes infected by spirals. Yes, spirals, as in the shape. And it starts off being just a bit weird, as people are obsessed by spirals. But things very quickly start to get a lot darker and more disturbing as people start twisting themselves into spirals. They start turning into snails, because snails have spirals in their shells. They deal with tornadoes and so on and so forth, with all different kinds of manifestations of spirals. Now, it doesn't seem like something as simple as a shape ought to be the stuff of a horror story, much less one that might actually disturb the reader. But the spirals in Uzumaki take on an almost Lovecraftian kind of cosmic horror. This was a serialized story in Japan in the late 1990s, though you can easily get this collected volume translated into English. Because it was a serial, there are very distinct chapters, almost like a series of vignettes related to these horrifying spirals. But it's not quite a series of vignettes, because though some of the characters and events do come and go, other characters and events carry over from one story to the next, or from one chapter to the next. So it's a bit more disjointed than a typical novel, but that actually only adds to the strange and slightly disturbing nature of the storytelling itself. For an American reader, if you're not familiar with reading manga, Japanese comic books, the experience of reading a story backwards, which is right to left, backwards for us, that experience can be a bit jarring and it might add to the weirdness. Because I don't read a whole lot of manga, that admittedly is something that takes me a few minutes to get used to whenever I do pick one up. Though you will be surprised how fast it starts to seem natural to read from right to left once you get into one. But the thing that really earns this book its place on my list is the artwork itself. Some of you may have seen photographs from the book floating around the horror pages online for quite a while now, though if you haven't seen them yet, I recommend you should avoid them until you've read the book, because you want to be surprised by some of the things that are depicted in these pages. After you read it, you'll find yourself starting to notice spirals everywhere in your life. It turns out there are a lot of spirals around. Indeed, while he was starting to work on it, Junji Ito himself said he became somewhat obsessed by spiral patterns and took them to symbolize something like infinity. Combined with the clear Lovecraftian influences on his writing, I think it's pretty easy to see how this book can take something as simple and harmless as a geometric pattern and turn it into something rather disturbing. Uzumaki has been adapted as a live-action film, which I still haven't seen, although I keep meaning to, and there's also a forthcoming anime adaptation that's supposed to be released later in 2022. Next up is a book that's disturbing because it's more or less a true story, and that is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. I might just as easily have chosen the same author's magnum opus, The Gulag Archipelago, for this list, but I instead went with this one for two reasons. First, The Gulag Archipelago is a non-fiction book, whereas One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich has the narrative structure of a novel. And second, this book is substantially shorter than the 3-volume Gulag Archipelago. But both books tell a similar story, albeit in different formats. The story is that of the Soviet Gulag system. This book was first published in Russian in 1962 and is a work of fiction in the sense that no such person as Ivan Denisovich ever existed. However, it's also a true story in that it accurately portrays the brutality and hopelessness of life inside the Soviet forced labor camps. Solzhenitsyn himself was a victim of the gulags, though one of the relatively fortunate ones who survived the experience and was able to write about it later. Indeed, Ivan Denisovich was the first Russian work to publicly discuss the horrors of the Soviet system. This isn't as disturbing as some of the other books in the sense of raw violence or brutality. If you watched my previous video and read some of those books, then you know how horrifying the things are that happen in some of the books that I read. Many of them are tremendously violent and disgusting. Nothing of the sort happens in this book. Rather, it's a more intellectual kind of disturbing because the reader comes to understand the horrifying accuracy of its title. The one day in the title is a complete accounting of a single day in this prisoner's life from morning to night. And the horrifying part is that it could be any day because all the days are more or less exactly the same. Though not marketed as a horror novel by any means, it's frightening because if you read it deeply, you come to understand the brutality of a government that would force innocent men into slave labor under conditions that simply had no reason to exist. Scenes in this book describe prisoners engaged in construction projects wherein time becomes a factor because they're working in conditions so cold that the mortar for their bricks will freeze if they take too long. Other scenes describe characters' elation at receiving an extra morsel of substandard food or finding a piece of scrap metal that might be useful as a tool of some kind. The thing that's disturbing about this book is that the characters have been so completely destroyed by the Soviet system that they have absolutely no real hope for the future. The best they can hope for is day-to-day animalistic survival. While many of the books we discuss involve the destruction of the human body in a variety of extremely gruesome ways, this book painstakingly describes the destruction of the human spirit. Solzhenitsyn's book has been productively compared to Night by Elie Wiesel. It's an easy comparison to make. Both authors won the Nobel Prize as a result of their books, and both books sought to expose the horrors of totalitarian regimes. The Nazis in the case of Night, and the Soviets in the case of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. But the comparisons and the horror runs even deeper, because one of the most horrifying truths revealed in both books is the discovery, made independently by the Nazis and the Soviets, that the best way to perpetuate the prison camp system was to keep the prisoners in constant fear, not only of the guards, but of each other. In fact, I could easily have included Night on this list, or perhaps Viktor Frankl's masterpiece, Man's Search for Meaning, although the latter isn't just a memoir of the concentration camps, but manages to end on a more positive and less disturbing note by outlining Frankl's psychological theory of logotherapy. However, I ultimately chose Solzhenitsyn's book for this list because while everyone knows how evil the Nazis were, comparatively few people seem to have a real solid grasp of just how bad the Soviet Union was. And I think that's an important piece of history that mustn't ever be forgotten. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich may not be the most violent of the books on this list, and certainly isn't a stereotypical horror story, but I do consider it easily the most important of the books on this list, and I think it fits perfectly within the horror genre. Possibly even more so than many of the things we read, because of its historical significance. Our next entry is by far the shortest book on this list, and that's this little chapbook by Kelli Owen. It's actually not a novel, but two connected short stories called Left for Dead and Fall from Grace. Sometimes in horror, short fiction can actually pack more of a punch than longer novels, because there's no time or space for the reader to get used to things. Instead, they just hit us hard and then leave us on that devastating note. Both of these stories are excellent examples of exactly that. It's a bit difficult to describe these stories without giving too much away, and these are certainly the kinds of stories you want to read cold. Knowing too much about what they're about will take all of the oomph out of the very things that earn them their place on this list in the first place. But what I will tell you is they're both disturbing, though in different ways. The first and shorter story is Left for Dead, and it has the kind of disturbing violence that's just viscerally horrifying. The whole story is like that, but there's one scene in particular that managed to get to even somebody as jaded and desensitized as myself. But it's not just violence and gore for the sake of violence and gore. There's a narrative revelation in the story that changes how the reader interprets everything that happened before, and arguably, that's even more disturbing than the violence. The longer of the two stories is Fall from Grace, and it's a sequel to the first one. What's interesting is that while the first one fits comfortably within the extreme horror subgenre and ends up giving us one of the more successful examples of that kind of extreme violence, the second one actually tones down the gore quite a bit, treating us instead to a more psychologically disturbing story. Rather than hitting us in the gut with depictions of violence, it hits us intellectually with a fascinating glimpse at human psychopathology. Both stories are disturbing in their own ways, independently, but it's really the collection of the two, taken together, that makes it hit particularly hard. In fact, the book is so extreme it's been banned on Amazon. Now, I don't actually think that's the best metric of how disturbing a book is. After all, plenty of other books on this list are just as disturbing, and Amazon hasn't touched them. And of course, Amazon is happy to sell plenty of truly disgusting and controversial books, as they should. It's not a bookstore's job to decide what people should or shouldn't be able to read. The problem is, once a bookseller steps across that line and allows themselves, even in one case, to make that decision for someone else, then any of their employees start to feel empowered to make literary decisions for other people. And there have been several cases in which Amazon has removed books for purely political reasons. With that in mind, and knowing how huge a company Amazon actually is, it's not entirely surprising that some mindless employee who happened across Kelli Owen's book found it too disturbing and removed it from the store. I don't think there's some vast conspiracy of Amazon employees to censor horror novels. I just think they made a horrible mistake to give their employees that kind of power without any kind of meaningful oversight or appeals process. Regardless of Amazon's censorship practices, the book is still available directly from the author's website. Be warned, though, that you don't actually want to read even the short description on the book's ad copy on that website. Just get a copy and read it. Kelli Owen was also the author of my pick for the best horror novel of 2021, The Headless Boy, so you know you're in for a dark and disturbing treat. Next up is a book that's no stranger to lists like these, and that's The Resurrectionist by Wrath James White. Rath is known for his work in extreme horror, so I honestly could have picked from any number of his books for this list. And since The Resurrectionist is actually one of the better known ones, maybe I should have selected one of his more recent titles. However, there's just something about this book that makes it one of my favorites, and I'd be remiss if I didn't discuss it. I don't really want to spoil anything, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about one scene, because I think that's the best way to set the stage. Don't worry though, it's just the first couple of pages, so I'm not telling you anything you won't get from the first half of the first chapter. The Resurrectionist is a book that opens with a young boy witnessing his own father raping and brutally murdering his mother. Seriously, that's the first 2 pages, and things only get more disturbing from there. The premise is that the story follows a psychopath who likes to murder people, common enough in horror literature, but in this case he also has the miraculous power to bring people back to life, with no wounds, no scars, and no memory of what has happened to them. And this character uses that power to every possible advantage, so there's a lot of extreme horror and violence in this book. But the thing of it is, though extreme horror can be disturbing on its own, the thing that actually makes this even more disturbing, and also so much better than just violence for the sake of violence, is that the author takes us through some rather deep philosophical and psychological ideas along with the violence and gore. The very heart of the book has an interesting philosophical question about it. That is, if you have the power to undo your crimes so that no one even remembers them, what harm has actually been done? The brutality of the crimes depicted in this book certainly suggests an answer, but I think it's a question worth thinking about. Do we judge our experiences by the experiences themselves in the moment, or by the memory of them? I read an article a while back that suggested we don't really understand how anesthesia works for surgery, and that it's possible it affects memory rather than consciousness, with the effect that patients could be fully aware of the intense pain of being cut open for their surgical procedures, but then lack all memory of the experience after waking up. It's a horrifying thought that is almost certainly wrong, but it's the same kind of disturbing idea that's at the heart of The Resurrectionist. The book also explores plenty of other fertile intellectual ground, including thoughts about justice, religion, and even some philosophical musing regarding what it says about all of us, that we even read this kind of stuff. All of which means, as much as this book treats us to an almost endless depth of violence, it's also fully aware of exactly what it's doing and gives us a lot to think about. And to me, that doesn't just make it a better book, but it actually makes it a more disturbing one. Extreme violence is easy. Extreme violence with some thought behind it, that takes real talent, and The Resurrectionist is one of my favorite books for that reason. Finally, I want to close out this list with a book I only recently discovered. It just came out a couple years ago, so I'm not too late to the party, but I was thrilled when I did come across it during last year's KillerCon. That book is The Slob by Aron Beauregard. What to say about this book? I'll be the first to admit it's not as intellectually disturbing as some of the other books on this list. That's not to say it's mindless or just violence for the sake of violence. Far from it. It has a well-drawn lead character and an engaging and intriguing plot. It just doesn't center on philosophical ideas quite as much. For philosophy, the best we can really say about it is that it's an extreme example of the psychological deficits that result from being, well, a slob and neglecting one's basic hygiene. And in fact, I think there's actually some important psychology behind that idea, but to say that's the main theme of the book is maybe a bit of a stretch. But let me tell you, while there may not be as much philosophy or theology or that sort of thing in this book as in the previous one, when it comes to the gross out, this one takes the gold. I've read a lot of horrifying stuff. Violent books, gross books, disturbing books, you name it. This is the only one with a scene of extreme violence that's ever really made me feel queasy. And if you know these other books, both the ones from this list and the ones from the previous video, you know what a large statement that is. However, while this book isn't at all shy about going for the gross out, it's not just gross without any redeeming qualities. We've all read books that were just disgusting but had no interesting characters or such ludicrous plots that they were painful to get through. I'm not naming names here, but I have a feeling some of you at least know some of the books I'm talking about. This is not that. This is a real, honest-to-God novel that tells the kind of horror story you want to read. It just also happens to hit you right in the gut with stuff you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. The book takes place in 1988 and tells the story of our main character, Vera. She grew up in a slobbish kind of household, and it turned her into an obsessive neat freak. She puts her skills to good use, making good money selling carpet shampoos door to door. And then she ends up knocking on the wrong door and stumbling into one of the most disgusting scenes I've ever read about, inhabited by one of the most disgusting characters I've ever read about. Normally, I don't believe in trigger warnings. I tend to take the view that we're all adults, and if you choose to read horror, you know what you're getting yourself into. This one, though, I'm going to go ahead and warn you that this book really is only for those of you who want to put your own fortitude to the test. It's become one of my favorites, but it's certainly not for everyone. It's not even for most people. It's a brilliant book, but it's more like the graduate course in extreme horror. You probably want to make sure you finish your undergraduate readings first. That said, it's the first of Aron Beauregard's works that I've read, and I guarantee it's not going to be the last. There's a sequel to The Slob that came out just last year, which I haven't read yet, but I already have my copy and I am very much looking forward to it. Mr. Beauregard has certainly earned my respect as a maestro of the truly vile and disturbing. So that's it. Another 5 of the most disturbing books I've ever read, which certainly make them at least among the most disturbing books on the market. But I'm sure there are others I'm still missing. So as I said at the beginning of the video, do be sure to leave me a note down in the comments with your own recommendations. And if you haven't seen it yet, check out my previous list of disturbing books. Or indeed, check out any of my other wonderful videos. I'll be back next time with more horrifying, but presumably less disturbing goodness, so stick around for that. Until then, take care and stay scared.